Hello, my friends, and this is the truth they don't want you to hear. What just happened in Moscow wasn't a statement. It wasn't a comment. It wasn't even a reaction. It was a detonation, a political shockwave that instantly vaporized the fantasy world Washington, Brussels, and Kiev have been desperately clinging to for nearly 3 years. Minutes before I began speaking to you, President Vladimir Putin himself said something so blunt, so decisive, so historically significant that anyone with even a shred of strategic awareness should feel the temperature drop in the room. Let me remind you, word for word, the essence of what Putin stated. This 28-point proposal was never discussed with Russia in any meaningful way, and we understand why, because the U.S. has not been able to force Ukraine to accept it. Ukraine is opposed, and Ukraine and Europe still cling to the illusion that they can strategically defeat Russia. They do not understand the real situation on the battlefield, nor what their denial will ultimately lead to. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not diplomacy. That is not negotiation. That is not posturing. That is a warning. A clear, cold, strategic warning that the West is running out of time, out of manpower, out of credibility, and out of luck. The reality, Ukraine is collapsing and Russia knows it. You can ignore propaganda. You can argue narratives, but you cannot escape math. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense figures that even anti-Russian institutions like ISW and the Atlantic Council quietly echo Ukraine is losing 40,000 killed or wounded every month. On top of that, between Vint, 0 desertions per month, at best, Ukraine is bleeding 60,000 soldiers every single month. Meanwhile, according to Western admissions, Ukraine is only mobilizing around 17,000 per month. Do the math. You don't need calculus. You don't need algorithms. You don't even need intelligence briefings. All you need are 10 fingers, 10 toes, and honesty. Ukraine cannot survive this. Russia knows this. Washington knows this. Brussels knows this. Zelensky knows this too, but he can't say it aloud without ending his career overnight. And now comes the most embarrassing part for the West. This so-called peace plan drafted in Washington, whispered about in Europe, waved around in Kiev as if it means something was never even presented to Russia until the absolute last minute. Think about that. The West is trying to negotiate a settlement to a war without talking to the country that's winning the war. This is delusion on stilts. This is arrogance on autopilot. This is strategic suicide dressed up as diplomacy. Putin made it extremely clear Russia is ready to talk. Russia is willing to discuss, but Russia will not negotiate from weakness because Russia is not weak. And that is what terrifies the West. The Chugawata Point Plan, a document written in a parallel universe, let's break it down. Point 6, Ukraine keeps a 600,000 man army. Absolutely impossible. Russia would never allow a heavily armed, openly hostile, Western-controlled military on its border again. Point 10, AU as security guarantee. A guarantee from a nation that breaks treaties like promises on a bar napkin? A guarantee requiring Russia to trust Washington? Not going to happen in this lifetime or the next. Point 14, use frozen Russian funds to rebuild Ukraine. Imagine walking into someone's house, stealing their wallet, and then announcing, we're going to use your money to renovate your neighbor's kitchen. Russia's answer is simple. Give back the money you stole or stop pretending this is diplomacy. Point 21, freeze the line of contact. Freeze what? Zaporizhia is collapsing. Kherson is collapsing. Donetsk is collapsing. Ukrainian lines are breaking open everywhere. Russia's advancing now, not someday, not hypothetically right now. You can't freeze a map while the other side is rewriting it with artillery. Zelensky's meltdown proves that the West is panicking. Zelensky went on camera today looking like a man reading his own political obituary. He admitted the U.S. is pressuring him. Deadlines are being imposed on him. His red lines no longer matter. He fears that accepting this plan means Ukraine loses freedom and justice. Here's the truth. Without a plan, Ukraine loses existence. And Zelensky knows it. European elites are playing with Ukrainian blood because it isn't their blood. EU figures like Kaja Kallas arrogantly declare, You need Ukraine and Europe to agree. Russia must retreat. Russia must stop attacking. Easy to say when your citizens aren't the ones being fed into trench graves and your country isn't disintegrating demographically and your army isn't being rebuilt from prisoners and retirees. Russia isn't losing sleep over Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. They're rounding errors in global geopolitics. But guess what? The $48 billion corruption pipeline running through Estonia suddenly explains the loudest anti-Russia voices. Follow the money and suddenly everything makes sense. What Russia is signaling now and why it matters. Russia is done with illusions. Russia is done with Western manipulation. Russia is done pretending Ukraine is an equal negotiating partner. Putin said it plainly. All the objectives of the special military operation will be fulfilled, not debated, not postponed, not negotiated away, fulfilled. And that includes full control of Donetsk, full control of Luhansk, full control of Zaporizhia, full control of Kherson, strategic control of the Dnieper, and likely Odessa and Kharkov. When this ends, and it will, the map of Eastern Europe will not look like it did in 2021. It will look like what Russia decides after winning on the battlefield. So where does this end? Not with a compromise, not with a handshake, not with a just and lasting peace drafted in Brussels by people who couldn't find Donetsk on a map. This ends the same way World War II ended in Berlin, with one side, Russia, dictating terms, and the other side, Ukraine, having no choice but to accept them. Russia's already preparing for the post-war security architecture, counterinsurgency operations, reconstruction, administrative integration, a new geopolitical order. The West still thinks it's negotiating. Russia knows the war is already won. Final word, and listen carefully. I'm not here to comfort you. I'm not here to sugarcoat reality. I'm not here to sell you the fantasy media narrative. I'm here, as Larry C. Johnson, to deliver the truth. Russia holds every card. Ukraine is out of time. The West is out of moves. And the world is watching a geopolitical shift that will be remembered for the next 100 years. This is not the end. This is the turning of an era. And history, once again, is being written in Moscow, not Washington. Let's take what we just saw out of Washington about Ambassador Mike Huckabee meeting Jonathan Pollard. The White House says they didn't even know it was going to happen, that it wasn't on the official schedule, and that intelligence was surprised. Think about what that says. When a sitting U.S. ambassador meets a former American who did 3 decades for spying for Israel, and the White House wasn't aware, that tells you the U.S. government is not running a unified foreign policy machine. It's factions, it's parallel channels, it's chaos. And this matters because that same chaos is what produced this so-called 28-point peace plan. And so when people ask, is this plan serious? And my answer is serious people don't operate like this. Now let's move to the battlefield update because that's the real engine driving everything. Russia's chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov, reported directly to Putin that Kupiansk has been liberated. And Putin, standing there in uniform with his commanders, didn't mince words. He called the Kiev leadership an organized criminal gang enriching itself while ordinary Ukrainians and soldiers bleed. You can mock the language if you want. Western media will clutch pearls and call it propaganda. But here's the blunt truth. Putin is describing a system that has burned through a country's manpower, hollowed out its institutions, and sold its sovereignty inch by inch for foreign money. And if you don't like that sentence, take it up with reality. Because the facts are brutal. The plan that's being pushed on Kiev right now is not a peace plan. It's a capitulation memo dressed in diplomatic perfume. There's even a hard U.S. deadline for Zelensky to accept it by November 27, right around Thanksgiving. That deadline alone tells you what this is, an ultimatum, not negotiation, not partnership, ultimatum. Russia didn't even receive this plan through official channels at first. So what did the Kremlin do? Did they panic? Did they scream? Did they beg? No. They did what a country does when it is winning. They kept their distance, let the West publicly own the mess, and then reaffirmed the obvious: Russia is not stopping. Russia is finishing the objectives of the SMO. Let me put this in plain English. Russia is not negotiating because it needs to. Russia is negotiating because it can afford to while continuing to advance. That is the difference between a losing side and a winning side. Read the full text and you'll see why no serious Russian strategist is impressed. Some parts tilt Moscow's way, like recognition of Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk. Fine. But the document is mostly designed for American benefit, not Ukrainian survival and certainly not Russian security. It tries to sell Russia a fantasy, come back into the Western-led global economy. Why? So Russia can be sanctioned again later? So its reserves can be frozen again later? So NATO can reset and try round 2 later? No. Russia learned the hard way that Western promises expire the moment they become inconvenient. So when Washington says, trust us again, Moscow hears. Walk back into the same trap, and not happening. And here's the piece the West still doesn't get. Even if Zelensky signs, even if Europe whines, even if Washington holds a summit and takes victory laps, the battlefield clock keeps ticking. Kupiansk, Pokrovsk, the steady grind, south and east. You can argue about narratives, but you cannot argue with ground control. And Russia is building that control one settlement at a time. Now Europe is getting dangerous. France's top general is publicly telling French society to prepare for war losses, even to lose our children. Stop and listen to that. A senior European commander is preparing the public for a wider war. Why? Because they know Ukraine is collapsing and they need the next story ready. They need a new enemy narrative to justify rearmament, budgets, control, and fear politics. And Russia sees right through it. Here's what the West expected. Russia to crack under sanctions, internal revolt, economic implosion, stalled fronts. Instead, they got the opposite. Russia retooled its economy, expanded production, stabilized the line, gained momentum. So now we're watching a Western establishment rushing out an ultimatum because they're staring at a strategic defeat unfolding in real time. Russia's message today is not, we want war forever. It's not, we refuse peace. It's this. You don't get to write a settlement while losing. You don't get to dictate terms from fantasy maps. And you don't get to ignore the 14th of June, 2024. From Moscow's point of view, that wasn't a suggestion. It was a door. They offered a way out. The West laughed, Ukraine bled, and now the door is closing. So what happens next? Russia will keep advancing until the so-called peace plan matches reality, not reality matching the plan. The plan matching reality, because that's how wars end, not in think tanks, not in press rooms, not on paper. They end where the flag stands. And right now, the flags are moving west. Everyone's excited about this so-called new 28-point peace plan. But when I actually go through what's being floated, I see mostly the same terms Russia has been stating for a long time. Ukraine cutting its military down, no foreign troops in Ukraine, no NATO membership, neutrality. Some versions even mention access to certain long-range systems being restricted. And again, that's been Russia's position for ages. Neutrality with EU access, but not NATO, recognizing Russian language officially, restoring formal status to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, elections within 100 days. Those are all things that have been on the table before in one form or another. But here's the problem. There's a lot of confusion because it looks like there is not just one peace plan. There are probably multiple drafts floating around. The bullet points that were leaked earlier by Western media, by Axios, Financial Times, Reuters, that is one set of talking points. Then what came out yesterday afternoon and today, the 28-point list leaked by a Ukrainian parliament member and picked up by the New York Post and others, that is a very different document. There's overlap, sure, but the differences matter. For example, the Ukrainian leaked version doesn't even mention Russian as an official language, doesn't mention the Orthodox Church either. It puts an exact cap on Ukrainian forces at 600,000. That number doesn't represent demilitarization. It basically keeps Ukraine at the same size or even bigger than it is right now. It also doesn't clearly mention giving up long-range weapons or missiles. So when people say this is Russia's plan, well, not really. At best, it's a chaotic mix of discussion points. My guess, and Alexander's guess was similar, is that different drafts were presented to different people. Maybe Witkoff kicked around ideas with Russian officials. Maybe some were taken to Kyiv, then amended heavily by Ukrainian inputs. So what we are seeing now are not final treaties. These are not binding deals. These are talking points being pushed around in a rush. And why the rush? Because the situation on the front lines for Ukraine is catastrophic. That's the real driver of all this peace plan frenzy. Russia is advancing rapidly, and it's taking everything you name, Kupiansk, Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, the entire belt is cracking. This runs completely counter to the information Trump was getting from Kellogg and the Kyiv pipeline, where they were telling him it's a stalemate, everything's under control. Putin even made that point before we recorded. Russia was telling everyone weeks ago that they were advancing across the front, but Ukraine and Europe were deluded or lying about reality. So what I think happened is simple. Reality has slammed into the Trump White House. Trump is freaked out because he sees where this is going, and Afghanistan collapsed times 100. That kind of humiliation scares him to death. So now he's trying to hurry up and patch something together before the battlefield ends, this in a way the West can't control. Now, there are rumors like the Telegraph one saying Russia would pay a rental fee for Donbass. No one knows how that would even work, and Russia would never accept that. Russia isn't paying rent for territory its army controls and that it recognizes legally as Russian. That idea only exists in Western fantasy space. And that gets us to the U.S. pressure on Zelensky. The U.S. can impose whatever it wants on Zelensky. They absolutely have that power. This is a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia, and Ukraine is just the proxy. If Trump wanted to end it immediately, he could halt weapons and intelligence the next day and the war would collapse, but he didn't. He chose escalation. He chose Kellogg's path, Rubio's path, Macron's path, the European globalist path, and now he's paying the price. Even if the U.S. cuts intelligence tomorrow, here's the truth. Ukraine is not going to make it either way. With intelligence, they lose. Without intelligence, they lose faster. The only thing that could delay the Russian advance is U.S. boots on the ground. Not Europeans, not NATO, they wouldn't last a day. Actual American combat troops. Is Trump willing to do that? I don't think so. So the collapse continues. Zelensky's speech reflects that reality. He says, pressure is at its most intense. Ukraine faces a choice between accepting an ugly deal or losing a key partner and enduring a brutal winter. The fact he isn't doing his usual loud rejection tells me he knows there is no alternative. Not because he wants peace, but because the battlefield has removed his options. Now, could this be Trump doing a theatrical de-escalation before escalating again? With Trump, anything is possible, one day one thing, next day another. But there are hints this might be more than theater. Kellogg allegedly getting sidelined matters because he was the escalation engine. You military officials suddenly going to Kyiv matters because it suggests the White House thinks it was lied to about the battlefield. They're trying to see reality with their own eyes. But even if they escalate further, tomahawks, more missiles, more sanctions, none of that changes the outcome. It only changes how many Ukrainians die before the outcome becomes undeniable. The refinery strikes barely dent Russian capacity. Sanctions didn't break Russia. Russia adapted and scaled. So the peace plan explosion is not because the West discovered morality. It's because Russia's advances made denial impossible. Pokrovsk being taken opens the road toward Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the last fortified gates of Donbass. Once those fall, there is nothing solid left before the Dnieper line. Russia will move fast. And then there's corruption. Nobody should be shocked by corruption in Ukraine. The only shocking thing is Western media pretending it's a revelation. But this scandal matters because it hits Zelensky's inner circle during blackouts, during freezing winters, while people are dying. Golden toilets, piles of cash, elite parties. That imagery cuts through everything. It destroys morale. It turns public mood from fight for every inch to just stop this madness so we can live. And that's why this is all happening at once. Military collapse, political panic, peace plan chaos, leadership rot, and a population losing faith. So where does this go? Russia keeps advancing until any peace paper finally matches reality. not reality matching the plan matching reality. That's how wars actually end. I'm Larry C. Johnson, and that's the real picture, whether Washington likes it or not.